for the Agile community. www.Agile.FM.
Today I'm here with two guests. I have Patricia Kong and Kurt Bittner, both from Scrum.org. Patricia, let's start with Patricia first. She's the product owner of enterprise solutions at Scrum.org. She's the co-creator of Nexus, and when I say co, that is with Ken Schwaber and others in the team. She is behind the evidence-based management, Scrum Studio, and Scrum Development Kit. She is fluent in 4 languages. Kurt Bittner is the VP of Enterprise Solutions at Scrum.org. His background includes Ivar Jacobsen, IBM Rational Forest Research, and he's the author of 3 books, also with now Scrum.org. Patricia and Kurt have written a book called The Nexus Framework for Scaling Scrum, continuously delivering an integrated product with multiple Scrum teams. That is the focus of today's talk, is Nexus. Welcome to the podcast, both of you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
You make us sound very exciting.
I am excited because I do want to talk about Nexus today for 2 reasons. First, the book is out, right? The book was written by the 2 of you, plus Dave West, who's not on the podcast, but I had him in the past. And we also want to talk about the new Nexus Guide, which just recently came out. So, where do we start? Let's start with the Nexus Guide. How is that?
Let's do it.
Yeah, the new version is out. I think it was like 2.5 years or so between the versions. What's the update? What's new in the new Nexus?
Yeah, so I think 2.5 years, right? We're in 2018 now, right? So we actually launched Nexus in 2015. And everything we had there was really just how can we add minimally to the Scrum framework to scale, right? So Nexus is a framework for multiple teams working together to build one product. And it was really interesting because at that time, obviously scaling has been a buzz, and we essentially said, you know what, if people really want to scale, let's look at delivery. Can people get product out the door done, right? And so I remember those conversations with Ken and really talking about the teams, and I've been writing a lot about scaling and generally what is that motivation for scaling? What does that really mean? And it's about getting more done in a shorter time frame, and also just, you know, organizations have seen pockets of Scrum work successfully. So what works? So 2015, we came out with the framework there, and that was the first release. So we had a lot to learn. And in this new update, it was honestly just a lot about clarification, specifically, you know, kind of cleaning up a little bit of language, but clarification about the new role that was introduced, which is the Nexus Integration team. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Nexus Integration team, but it's people that are on the different teams that are in a Nexus, and they come together and they're there to serve the Nexus and to say, hey, what do we have to do to improve? We have to be accountable for integration. What are the different things that we can do to help us as individual teams become successful as one unit, as a Nexus? So that role is completely described in the Nexus Guide. We just clarified a few different things that were really confusing. So for instance, on the Nexus Integration team, you have the product owner, and then you have a Scrum Master, and then you have different, what we call Nexus Integration team members from the different teams. The thing is we used to describe this as a Scrum team, so that just caused a lot of confusion, and it was just really because of the composition of the roles, right? And so that kind of thing had to change, and then the purpose and the intention of this role has been further delineated. So that was one big thing.
Right. Yeah, so if I could just interject, because I remember when it came out in 2015, and I was reading, I think it was the first page of the Nexus Guide. I remembered, or I recognized that I must have missed an hour of biology class, because I had to Google exoskeleton, right, and the definition of it and how that would relate. That word is missing now.
Yes, because a lot of people had to do what you had to do in order to understand it. So the notion that Nexus itself is an exoskeleton was really to say, hey, how do we, like an exoskeleton, when you think about bugs and all these different things, and what serves as a shell essentially to protect the individual Scrum teams, but also to make them stronger. That was the intention behind Exoskeleton. In a guide, that doesn't work as well. In a visual and in a conversation, it works well. But the real definition that we talk about with Nexus is just that it is a connection between things, right? It's just linking people together in a network, and that's the big thing. The Nexus integration team is there to help make sure that happens and to serve the adaptation of Nexus. The two things I think we really stressed was, I don't know if Ken's going to listen to this, but we really named it kind of poorly, but the Nexus integration team is named that, not because they actually do integration, but because they're there to make sure that it's happening. So it's that focus of integrating everything together.
Yeah. So I hear people when they talk about scaling, they make like a reference to like the Scrum of Scrums, like SOS and so forth, right? The integration team goes far beyond that. Do you mind like going a little bit deeper on that integration team? Because I think that's a key instrumental piece of that process, right? We're getting something done with a team of like a diverse skill set here on that integration team.
Yeah, well, and to carry on to something Patricia was saying, that Nexus integration team, so it's not responsible for doing the integration, and that's one major area that people mistake, is that they hear the name, they think, that's the team that does integration. Really, it's the responsibility of the teams, the Scrum teams, to integrate the product. Right. And what the Nexus integration team does, though, is that it helps those teams to provide focus to get that integration done. So that can involve a lot of different things. Sometimes it means helping them perhaps put together a continuous integration strategy and framework and tools. And sometimes it means essentially, in a sense, calling BS on the team, saying, you're not really doing an integrated product. We need to get better at this, but it's a we thing. So that notion that most of the Nexus integration team members are actually members of the Scrum teams themselves. So the Nexus integration team is more virtual than physical. So it's unlike the other teams. It's not a separate team that's doing this integration work and sort of lording over everybody. But collectively, you can think of these people when they need to come together to help the Nexus to get things done, to produce integrated working product. In a sense, they shift into kind of a different mode. It might involve coaching. It might involve helping to clear obstacles and impediments. Doing things that all the teams need, and they agree collectively to work together to get something done. So I like to think of it as this mostly virtual thing, but but as team members, these members of the Scrum teams who are on the Nexus integration team, what they're tasked with is being accountable for actually delivering on that working increment. So unlike the Scrum of Scrums, which is pretty informal, you just kind of get together and, hey, what are you working on? Oh, what are you working on? Yeah, it's more complex than that. But the point is that that's a very informal mechanism, and that informal collaboration between teams doesn't go away. But when things aren't getting done, someone has to be accountable. And so having that specific role for the Nexus integration team, or the NIT, is really important. And that's one of the things that differentiates Nexus from simply an informal Scrum of Scrums approach.
Right, and that's going to vary depending on the number of teams you have. But I'm really happy that you start to talk about what they do, because integration is one misconception, but the other one that I've talked about is that it's not a management team, and people face that and say, they get excited because they think the Nexus integration team is now this management team, and it's not. It's not. Yeah. That's specifically what we've outlined is that they're members of the different teams. Optimally, they're members because that serves the bottom-up intelligence, right? That's what we as Agilists talk about all the time, and so it's we are them and they are us, and there's no authority in that sense that exists.
Yeah, I mean, for me personally, the Scrum of Scrum has always fell short because of exactly what you just said, Kurt. Right? It's a gathering of Scrum Masters. Whereas here we do have, and I want to highlight that to everybody listening to this. maybe not familiar with this process is there is a technical person on that integration team, right?
Optimally, yes.
Optimally, right? So architectural things being not only discussed or recommendations are being given, these people are taking it back to their teams. Is that correct?
Right.
Right.
That is
because that collection of, if you just have a collection of Scrum Masters, it becomes inefficient there also, right? You know, the Scrum Master's got to go talk to somebody, to come back, and then they rejoin again, and that's just not always the most effective thing to do.
Yeah. Well, there are several processes out there without, we're talking about Nexus here, but for scaling, right? And Nexus is really on the rise, right? So we see more discussions about these things in the industry. But what makes Nexus in comparison to others so special, in your opinion?
Well, I like to think of it as, in a sense, the absolute minimum. In a sense, the absolute minimum extensions that you need on top of Scrum to really enable this multi-team collaboration on a single product. Doesn't mean that those are the only things that you could use. You could use lots of other practices, but when you really want to, in a sense, scale it to the absolute essentials that you need to have multiple teams working together, this is what we feel is the absolute minimum. And there's a nice thing about starting with an absolute minimum approach and then adding things as, letting the teams decide what they need in addition. So I think that's one of the differentiators. The second one is that it maintains in a sense, the simplicity of Scrum in adding that. So it doesn't break Scrum. It doesn't cause anything about Scrum not to work. And so, one of the sayings that I remember Patricia saying to me probably, the first day we met was scaled Scrum is Scrum. So there's something nice about that because lots of people know Scrum. And so in order to scale, you don't have to learn much extra to use Nexus.
Right.
Yeah. I'm going to +1 that, and I think if I'm going to reference something Kurt said, it's let's not scale agility using waterfall. I'll answer this also in another way, which is some of the benefits that we've encountered and I've experienced working with different clients using Nexus is they talk about two things, and these might be organizations that have tried to scale in different ways. And one is that they're actually just able to get started. So they know Scrum, they can just get started. There's not a big something that has to happen before they start, scaling and getting product out the door. So they just use Nexus. It's like Scrum, they can do it. And it's pretty basic what they have to know. The second thing is that a lot of these stories, and there's a case study, a webinar that we talked about with Capital One, where this organization was, these teams were able to get a release out three weeks earlier than what they thought. And the fact is that they were able to do that. And then the biggest benefit for them, though, was that the teams were really happy. So these are still talking about, we're able to get work done. And by the way, we're happy while we're doing it. We're not suffering. And a lot of the time when we think about these other frameworks or transformation things or methods, there's still this big, the stories that I've heard on that side, and there's positive things, but it's a lot. We have told you that you are going to scale and change and do it this way. And I think this is a much more organic way. A lot of this is going to feel familiar to people who have been doing Scrum. And so there's just that inclusion and with the rigorous focus, I think, that we have towards the Nexus goal, which is saying, hey, everybody, we're all in this together working toward one thing. How can we get that done? And I think there's a lot of, all the psychology around that, around team behaviors is interesting.
Yeah. Well, there's the brilliance of this, of some of these concepts, right? Is, for example, just today I had a conversation about, how do we scale a project, right? It's like, why even scaling in one project, right? Like project of one team. Why do we scale a project of two teams, right? And it's like, well, I don't know if that's actually useful. And the Nexus guide actually says 3 to 9 teams, right? So it actually reminds people this is for larger programs, right? This is for the project of multi-team Scrum, working off on one product backlog. A lot of these Scrum teams out there, or Scrum projects, are not even falling into this category. They could just use simple Scrum, right? Basic out-of-the-box Scrum, read the Scrum guide, get certification, get your training under the belt, and get going. But this is really for large programs, right? You just mentioned Capital One, large organizations with large programs.
Right.
There's also something interesting that happens, when you talk about a company who has an existing project or program, and let's pick a large program. They might come and they might say, well, we've got thousands of people working on this program. How can something like Nexus possibly work for us? Mm-hmm. But there's loads of examples in the industry of people using Agile approaches, and they come in and they find a really large program in trouble. And the successful turnarounds of these things usually involve first scaling down before you scale up. Mm-hmm. And so, large program using a waterfall approach, or more, I would even call it ad hoc. It's not even that well organized. But they've got tons of people doing all sorts of things in parallel, not completing anything. And so the first thing is, scaling back to actually getting something working and delivering something, and then seeing where you need to scale from there. Mm-hmm. So the goal isn't, the goal shouldn't be when people scale to say, we've got 2,000 people working on this program, they all need to find a job in this new world. Right. Like, no, let's first simplify the problem, get it down to actually delivering working software, and then scale up from there. And what you often find when you do that is that you don't need thousands of people to do that kind of work.
Exactly.
Often it's an order of magnitude less. Mm-hmm. And there's plenty of examples. Ken's talked about the FBI project and other things where, you had hundreds of people and you sort of net it down to a small team, and they're actually able to deliver much more effectively. So our goal with Nexus isn't to try to basically solve all the possible problems in program management, but rather to focus on this team collaboration to deliver working software. Mm-hmm. So that means that we're not dealing with portfolio management, we're not dealing with HR, we're not dealing with all these other things, we're not dealing with tons of different roles. But a lot of times when you actually scale down first and then scale up, you find you don't need all that stuff anyway. The portfolio management problem has already been solved for you because you've got a specific thing you need to deliver. Mm-hmm. Now, we're not saying that those other problems aren't interesting, but dealing with scaling to mix all those other things in often complicates it. So we like to start simple and then build up from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's been a pretty central message is that, don't scale if you don't need to. In fact, descale. And I think I'm going to say get out of the kitchen, because that's what everything you just said to me sounds like, get out of the kitchen. But it's true, right? We're not, I think what we thought what we were thinking about when we were putting together this framework was really what can we give a framework around? Because when you get into those other things that go beyond delivery, and it's not that, like Kurt said, that it's not important, but there are a lot of other things at play there, right? Mm-hmm. Politics being one of them. And so it's really hard to say, here is exactly what you should follow and do. And so those things are what make up some large programs. Mm-hmm. That being said, though, when we talk about practices, certainly, coming in and descaling and thinking about what we can actually do to get back on track mm-hmm. is very important. And also being able to measure that. Mm-hmm. Think about measuring the right stuff and what's valuable right. because it's really important.
Yeah. You guys mentioned earlier something about to have this thing very lightweight in terms of process like this, the shell here, right? There is something I've noticed. I don't know if you share this thing as well, but I've noticed in these large programs when these scaled approaches come in, that all of a sudden also the command and control behavior comes back in. I don't know what it is, but the question is who would manage this integration team, right? Or how do we standardize things across the board? And it usually happens when experienced Scrum teams that have worked previously as a single team now work in a program. I don't know, whenever scaling takes place, is that something you guys notice in the industry? But obviously, how does Nexus react to that?
Right. Well, I mean that's it seems to happen a lot, and we specifically don't do that. And one of the reasons is that, Patricia mentioned earlier, bottom-up intelligence, but it's also team motivation, is that when you start telling people what to do from outside the team, it disempowers them. And so all of the reasons that you've got benefits from Scrum, a lot of it comes from having an empowered, engaged team that's working with, within the scope of Scrum values and delivering working software. And all of a sudden you introduce this command and control and start telling people what they're going to do, even to the point where you start assigning product backlog items to different teams and dictating the architecture from the outside. All of these things really disempower people, and it removes all that really positive motivational qualities that you got out of Scrum in the first place. And so
That's right.
I really love this comment that one of our professional Scrum trainers made. We had a train the trainer session for our Scale Professional Scrum class, and it was last spring or summer. But he referred to Nexus as basically scaling Scrum without destroying its soul.
Oh,
and
yes.
so that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to keep the essence of Scrum, which is really about empowerment and team motivation, while you also scale it, as opposed to doing things that basically remove those positive qualities.
Right. And I think I would add, if there are people that want to or need to be in the conversation, the Nexus Integration team might be a place for them to participate, right, and actively work with the Nexus. But absolutely, a lot of the times, even when we're teaching and they ask these questions, we say, what do you do in single team Scrum? How is this different? Why is it working this way? Why are you actually trying to scale? And it is a lot of the different behaviors of just maybe insecurity and what transparency is out there. And this is what I was talking to with Kurt earlier when we were joking around about what comes first, the chicken or the egg, and is that around the same thing for transparency and trust? But and at scale that just gets magnified. And what Edwin Dando, who's the PST professional Scrum trainer that Kurt was talking about, is really this is about how to scale Scrum, how to scale Agile without crushing its soul, right? And so it goes back to, bottom-up intelligence, it's the teams. And, you can notice when those things are going wrong, and I was doing a talk about this also, because what you get is a lot of these, what they're calling Scrum zombies, right? And I said, what does a Scrum zombie look like? Well, it's, a person who essentially checks out, right? If I'm just going to build what you tell me to do, then this is no longer in the spirit of agility. So those things are such things that you can sense.
Right. All right, let's move on to the other topic I wanted to discuss a little bit. That's the book, obviously, the book you just released, the two of you plus Dave West. The Nexus framework for scaling Scrum, continuously delivering an integrated product with multiple Scrum teams. So we're writing January 2018. The book just got out like a few weeks ago. And there's a lot of books around Scrum. I believe this is the only one really that goes after Nexus. There is a Nexus guide out there for everybody to download on scrum.org. There is there's a certification and test questions and everything. But there is only this book. And what makes this book different? What did you guys cover in this book that is not part of the Nexus guide?
So thank you for bringing up the book. I'm starting to think when you list out all these names that we're really not terribly great at naming and titling things, because it doesn't illustrate the essence of this book and the passion. So we have a course. So we have a 2-day workshop, and what we do is we walk people through the Nexus framework in a case study, and that makes it real. So for instance, when you attend the class, you are feeling what it is like to do Nexus sprint planning, cross-team refinement. We have that all put together. And what we talk about is, here's the Nexus framework, but you're going to experience all these practices. So what Kurt and I and Dave thought was a great idea was to go through and say, this is experienced in real life. What if we explain the Nexus framework also through another story, through a lens of a company that Kurt can talk more to, but also what are all the additional practices we think that might help these teams. So we talk about the different circumstances. So I think that it was actually a really fun book, to write, and something that's different out there that will be easy to digest with additional resources.
Yeah. In doing the book, the challenge was that we have a guide. So really, the first chapter is just introduction. The second chapter of the book is really kind of a repeat of the guide, more or less, written in a little bit less declarative terms, so that it flows better in the storyline. But then chapters 3 through 8 are, as Patricia mentioned, essentially walking through a case study of a fictional company that we invented, basically to illustrate how Nexus was applied. So it's the chapters intersperse text that describes what the company is doing, and then commentary about how Nexus can help them and what they're doing and things like that. So think of it as an extended case study book that helps you look at, through examples, see how Nexus would be applied. So what's different about that are a couple things. I've read lots of books, written a few myself, and most books basically spend a lot of time talking about theory and not too much time talking about how it's applied. And this sort of dispenses with the theory, or we have one chapter of the theory, but the theory of Nexus is pretty simple. But then we spend the rest of the time really exploring different aspects of how that theory gets applied under different circumstances. So, we start off with a team start off as a single Scrum team, but then they need to move faster. They've gotten more money from venture capitalists, so they decide to add people and grow the team. So they grow up to 3, and then that causes some problems. And I remember one of the comments from the reviewers. They were actually being expressing a little frustration, because they say, well, the case study company, they're making all the mistakes everybody makes.
Yes.
And I said, that's exactly the point.
Yeah.
The challenges.
Because, it all sounds very easy when you talk about the theory, but what we do is actually have this team go through a lot of the typical mistakes that people make, and then they learn from it. We show in the book how you can actually make mistakes in a couple of sprints, and the world doesn't fall apart. You can use inspection and adaptation to improve, and you don't have to be perfect, which is the reality for most of us. We learn by making mistakes, and so in the book we have the teams making a lot of the typical mistakes people make, and then we show how they recover from that and how they use Nexus to recover from that. And eventually the team, through acquisitions and partnerships, it becomes distributed, and that introduces some new problems. Exactly. And so on and so on. So I think it was interesting to write, because it really, after a while, you start thinking about what's really likely to happen next to this team. And as I've read and listened to novelists talk about how the behavior of the characters really just starts emerging, and the same kind of thing was happening when we were writing the book. Is that it seemed like, well, in the next chapter, really, they should be dealing with this kind of problem, because that's pretty typical for a team at that point, and that point in their maturity. So I like that. I think it makes the book very accessible. And the other thing is, the book is pretty thin. It's about 150 or so pages. So if we're asserting that Nexus is really simple and easy to understand, it shouldn't be a 400-page book.
Right.
So it's nice. You could probably read it in an evening and take away a lot of good things about it.
It's actually why the Nexus Guide, for instance, is less pages than the Scrum Guide, because it's simple and it's even more complex, so we can say things. What's interesting is that the book, it starts from the story of one team and growing, but a lot of the challenges they face are also the same for if you start out and you have 10 teams and that's what you have. Think about. So it's relevant that way too.
So I can just see the reader right now reading that case study of fictional LLC, and in one of those later chapters, like, oh no, now they're going distributed. No. It's like more complexity, it's I can see that. But what's interesting though is I saw a metric from Standish Group maybe a year ago or so. And it was actually shocking on these very large programs, the success rate. I don't want to put a number out. I don't have it right now in front of me, but it was very, very low in terms of the success rate of that program compared to a small project. I think it was like 8 times more successful or something, small projects versus large. So there's so much room for improvement on these large initiatives, and hopefully Nexus can help a little bit with this.
Yeah,
yeah.
It certainly can. I had some similar statistics from a client that I worked with a number of years ago when I was doing consulting, and they analyzed more than 400 projects that they had done, and they found that basically teams that delivered on quarterly cycles or less succeeded about 80% of the time, and teams that delivered on 12-month cycles or greater failed about 80% of the time. So, some of the scaling issues have to do with reducing batch sizes and getting release cycles shorter, and there's lots of interesting things that sort of get thrown into the mix too. In the book we focus mostly on the teaming and collaboration issues because that's what Nexus is about. But there's lots of techniques, and we talk about a lot of the complementary techniques. Although our intent is not to write a book on continuous delivery, for example. There are excellent books that have already been written on that. So. We do have, in a lot of cases, we point off to those other books and footnotes and endnotes and things like that, so that we're trying to pull in these other practices without having to re-describe them.
Right.
So,
well, awesome. I do want to invite all those hundreds of thousands of Scrum Masters out there, possibly some of those listening to this. Check out Nexus, go to scrum.org, check out the guide, the latest guide, maybe pick up a book, the Nexus Framework for Scaling Scrum, and just see the concepts in action, and maybe give it a shot, at least have the equipment in case you ever have to scale your project. It's a good alternative to things out there. I want to thank you guys for this one here, giving me a little bit of input on the motivation, the new terminology, and so forth, and creating an appetite in the industry to get more. So thanks for that, Patricia and Kurt.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you.
And just for everybody who wants to connect, probably the easiest one is just through scrum.org. And just search there, and Twitter, and you're both on Twitter, yes, and just reach out to everyone and start the dialogue, and good luck to you, and thanks again.
Thank you for listening to Agile.FM, the radio for the Agile community. I'm your host, Joe Krebs. If you're interested in more programming and additional podcasts, please go to www.agile.fm. Talk to you soon.